Welcome to the deep dive, the place where we take these hefty stacks of source material and really try to boil them down for you.
Yeah, distill them into something useful.
Exactly. Today, we're navigating the, let's say, intricate world of musculoskeletal function and disease. We're pulling insights straight from Chapter 49 of Porth's Essentials of Pathophysiology, 5th edition.
And this chapter, it really does a great job of synthesizing things across the lifespan, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're looking at childhood skeletal growth issues, then metabolic bone problems in adults, and finally, something quite systemic: fatigue.
Right.
So our mission today, for you the listener, is to connect these conditions, these whats, with the underlying why, the mechanisms, without getting lost in the weeds.
It's a big task. We're going from like tiny details in bone formation all the way up to feeling completely exhausted system-wide. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting at the beginning, the skeleton's blueprint.
Right. So when we talk about bone structure, we first need to get clear on modeling versus remodeling. Modeling is, well, it's the big shaping process, forming the overall macroscopic skeleton. And that pretty much wraps up around, say, 18 to 20 years old.
So modeling's the construction phase, building the house.
Exactly. And if modeling is building the house, then remodeling is the lifelong maintenance crew.
Ah, okay.
Constantly cycling through breaking down old bone that's resorption and building new bone formation. Keeps the structure sound.
Got it. And in childhood, during that big construction phase, the key site is the epiphyseal growth plate, right?
Yeah, absolutely critical. Its job depends on this, like, perfectly choreographed sequence.
Yeah.
Cartilage gets made, then it calcifies, then it gets eroded away, and then osteoblasts move in to lay down actual bone. It has to happen in that order.
And if anything messes up that sequence, growth gets stunted or just goes wrong.
Precisely. Obvious things like trauma, and epiphyseal separation can tear the blood vessels needed for that osteoblast invasion. Growth stops.
Makes sense, but it's not just trauma, is it? You mentioned nutrition earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about scurvy. That's vitamin C deficiency. Vitamin C is crucial for collagen, the organic matrix. No matrix, no proper bone foundation.
Okay.
Or rickets vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D is needed for that calcification step. So the cartilage forms, but it just doesn't harden properly. The sequence stalls.
So subtle deficiencies can halt growth just as effectively as a fracture at that plate.
In essence, yes.
Yeah.
At that specific site.
Okay. Now, shifting gears slightly to structural stuff, like how kids walk, the chapter mentions things like toeing in or bowlegs often just fix themselves.
Yeah, a lot of those early gait things are physiologic, part of normal development, and they tend to resolve spontaneously. But some things, especially involving torsion, need a closer look.
Like toeing in or pigeon toe.
Right. If it's from metatarsus adductus, the foot has this kind of kidney shape. There's a grading system doctors use. Grade A fist is flexible. You can passively correct it, usually no treatment needed. But if it's a rigid grade third, or you see this deep skin crease on the inside border of the foot, that suggests it's more congenital, less likely to fix itself. Might need casting or bracing.
And what about femoral torsion? That sounds like the thigh bone itself.
It is. Normally, the femur has this inward twist called anteversion. It's actually quite high at birth, maybe 40 degrees.
Wow.
Yeah, but it naturally decreases to about 15 degrees by the time you're an adult. Now, if a child keeps too much of that internal rotation, that internal femoral torsion, they often find sitting in that W position really comfortable.
Oh, I know that position. Knees forward, feet splayed out back.
That's the one. But unfortunately, that position actually puts leverage on the growing femur and can make the inward torsion worse, or at least slow its correction.
Okay. So posture can influence bone development there.
Definitely. Now, sometimes these deformities aren't just developmental quirks, they're rooted in genetics.
Which brings us to osteogenesis imperfecta, OI. Brittle bone disease. This sounds serious.
It is. And here, the source material gets really specific about the mechanism. The core defect is flawed synthesis of type I collagen.
Collagen type I, isn't that like everywhere in the body?
Exactly. That's the key insight. It's the main protein in bone, yes, but also tendons, ligaments, skin, even the whites of the eyes, the sclera.
Ah, so that's why one of the signs can be blue sclerae?
Precisely. In the mildest form, type IOI, the sclera looks blue because the underlying veins show through the thin collagen, but the spectrum is huge. Type 2I is often lethal at or near birth because the skeleton is so poorly formed.
Wow.
Other types, like type 4, might have normal-looking sclerae but still suffer repeated fractures, have thin skin, weak muscles, loose joints. It's a systemic collagen problem. The genes involved are usually CO1A1 or CO1A2.
Okay. Sticking with development for one more condition, developmental dysplasia of the hip. DDH. What's the issue here?
DDH is basically a problem with how the hip joint forms. It can range from just being unstable to partially dislocated to subluxated to fully dislocated.
How common is it?
The source says about 1 in 100 infants have some instability. It's way more common in girls, like 6 times more, and often affects the left hip. They think that's related to how the baby is usually positioned in the womb.
And how do doctors check for this? The book mentions specific tests.
Yes, clinical maneuvers are key here. You need to kind of picture these. The Barlow maneuver is where the examiner gently tries to push the hip out of the socket posteriorly.
Okay, trying to dislocate it.
Yeah, gently testing stability. If it does slip out or feels like it could, that's a positive Barlow. Then comes the Ortolani maneuver.
Which is?
That's where the examiner gently abducts the hip, moving the thigh outwards, and tries to guide the femoral head back into the socket. If it was dislocated, you might feel or even hear this distinct clunk as it pops back in. That's the positive Ortolani sign.
A clunk. Okay, very tangible.
Very. And there's also the Galeazzi test. You lay the baby down, bend their knees up with feet flat on the table, and look if the knee heights are equal.
If one knee is lower?
It suggests the femur on that side might be shorter, or more likely, the hip on that side is dislocated, making the whole leg effectively shorter in that position.
Right. Those are some really hands-on diagnostic tools. Okay, that covers a lot of the growth and development issues.
It does. And it sets the stage for what happens when the skeleton matures. But the lifelong maintenance process goes wrong.
Which takes us to part 2, metabolic bone diseases. And the chapter starts with this general term, osteopenia.
Right. Osteopenia isn't a specific disease itself. It's more of a description, usually from imaging, like a DEXA scan. It just means the bone mass is lower than expected for the person's age, sex, and race.
It's a signpost, not the destination.
Exactly. It's the common feature you see across various metabolic bone diseases, signaling that something is wrong with bone density.
And the basis for many of these adult bone problems is when that remodeling cycle gets out of whack, right? That balance between resorption and formation.
Precisely. It's supposed to be a tightly coupled process. Osteoclasts dig out old bone, and in doing so, they release signals, soluble factors, that call in the osteoblasts to fill the hole with new bone, like a perfectly coordinated construction crew.
And what controls that coordination? Seems crucial.
It is. The key molecular control system described is a Rankel-PG system.
Okay, break that down.
So osteoblasts, the bone builders, produce a molecule called Rankel. Rankel then binds to a receptor called Rank, which sits on the surface of osteoclast precursors.
The cells that become bone eaters?
Exactly. When Rankel binds to Rank, it's like flipping a switch. The precursors mature into active osteoclasts, and bone resorption begins.
Okay, so Ranko drives bone breakdown. What stops it from going overboard?
That's where OPG comes in, osteoprotogerin. OPG is also produced by osteoblasts, interestingly enough. It acts like a decoy receptor.
A decoy?
Yeah, it floats around and intercepts Ranko before it can bind to Rank on the osteoclast precursors. So OPG effectively blocks osteoclast formation and activity, puts the brakes on resorption, maintaining balance.
So OPG is the protector of bone density, essentially.
You could think of it that way, yeah. It maintains homeostasis, which leads to the question, what happens if this system gets unbalanced?
And I guess the most common answer is osteoporosis.
Right. Osteoporosis is defined by a loss of mineralized bone mass. Resorption starts significantly outpacing formation. The coupling is broken. Clinically, it's defined using a T-score.
The T-score compares your bone density
to the average peak bone density of a healthy 30-year-old adult of the same sex. The score tells you how many standard deviations you are below that peak mean.
And what drives this loss?
Major risk factors are age, genetics. But a huge one, especially in women, is postmenopausal status.
Because of estrogen loss?
Exactly. Estrogen normally does 2 key things to help bone. It boosts OPG production.
The protector.
And it limits the development of osteoclast precursors. So when estrogen levels plummet after menopause, you lose the brakes, less OPG, and step on the gas, more precursors. Resorption ramps up.
Double whammy.
Pretty much. And it's often called a silent disease because you don't feel your bones getting weaker.
Until
you have a fracture, often from minimal trauma. The classic presentation is the vertebral compression fracture. Someone might just bend over or lift something light, and a vertebra collapses.
Leading to pain, loss of height.
And potentially that forward curvature of the upper spine, kyphosis, sometimes called a dowager's hump.
The chapter also mentions secondary causes, right, like medications.
Oh, definitely. Long-term corticosteroid use is a big one. Also certain malignancies, immobilization, and even things like the female athlete triad, where low energy availability, menstrual dysfunction, and low bone density intersect.
And that description of advanced osteoporosis, the bone cortex thinning out.
Yeah, the source describes it vividly. Figure 4915 shows how the inner or endosteal surface gets resorbed so much that the normally thick cortical bone starts to look porous, almost like cancellous or spongy bone inside. The eversion systems, those channels within the bone, become massively enlarged. It's visually striking, showing just how much structure is lost.
Okay, so osteoporosis is loss of bone. How does that differ from osteomalacia and rickets?
Good distinction. Osteomalacia in adults and rickets in children aren't primarily about losing bone mass. They're about a failure to mineralize the bone matrix that is there. The organic scaffolding is laid down, but it doesn't harden properly with calcium and phosphate, so the bone becomes soft.
Soft bones. And rickets is the childhood version affecting the growth plates.
Yes, because the growth plate cartilage doesn't calcify, it keeps proliferating, leading to characteristic widening at the ends of long bones. You get these very specific physical signs. An enlarged skull because the fontanelles are slow to close. And you can often feel or see enlargement where the ribs meet the cartilage. That's called the retitic rosary.
Retitic rosary, okay.
And the posture is often affected too. The source mentions a Buddha-like appearance, which refers to the combination of lumbar lordosis, inward curve of the lower back, and a protruding abdomen, partly due to weak abdominal muscles. The child's weight might be normal, but the skeletal structure is compromised.
Got it. Soft, poorly mineralized bone leading to visible deformities. Now, one more metabolic condition mentioned, Paget disease. This sounds different again.
It is quite different. Paget disease, or osteitis deformans, isn't systemic softening or loss.
Yeah.
It's characterized by local areas of wildly excessive and disorganized bone turnover.
Localized chaos.
Kind of, yeah. You get furious osteoclast activity, followed by equally furious but disorganized osteoblast activity. The new bone that's formed is structurally weak, abnormal, and often enlarged. Histologically, it has this classic mosaic-like pattern because of the irregular way it's laid down.
And what are the consequences of this chaotic bone?
Depends where it happens. If it's in the skull, it can compress cranial nerves, leading to things like tinnitus or hearing loss. If it's in the long bones of the legs, like the femur or tibia, they can bow under weight, leading to pain and a characteristic waddling gait.
That sounds bad enough, but the chapter mentions an even more serious complication.
Yes, a cardiovascular one.
Hmm.
These highly active pagetic bone lesions are incredibly vascular. They demand a huge blood supply. In widespread cases, the heart has to pump much harder to meet this demand, potentially leading to high-output heart failure. The heart simply can't keep up with the circulatory demands of the overactive bone. It's a really stark example of how a bone disease can have severe systemic consequences.
Wow. High output heart failure from bone turnover, that really drives home the systemic connection.
Absolutely. And speaking of systemic effects, that brings us perfectly to our final section, activity intolerance and fatigue.
Okay, first things first. How does the source differentiate these? They sound similar.
They are related but distinct. Activity intolerance is more about the objective lack of physical or mental energy reserves needed to do something. You just don't have the fuel in the tank.
Okay.
Fatigue, on the other hand, is the subjective sensation of exhaustion, weariness, lack of energy. And a key difference often cited is that normal tiredness is usually relieved by rest or sleep.
But fatigue isn't.
Right. Pathologic fatigue often persists despite adequate rest. That's a major clue.
The chapter talks about acute versus chronic fatigue. What's the difference there?
Acute fatigue is usually short-term, often serving a protective role. Think muscle fatigue after intense exercise. The source gives a great example. People using crutches.
Why do they get tired so fast?
Because walking with crutches relies heavily on arm and shoulder muscles, which are predominantly type 2 muscle fibers. These are built for short, powerful bursts, not sustained effort. They burn through their energy stores quickly and fatigue rapidly compared to leg muscles used for walking.
Ah, makes sense. So that's acute functional fatigue. What about chronic?
Chronic fatigue is different. It's often longer lasting, more pervasive, and typically associated with underlying chronic illnesses. Think cancer, multiple sclerosis, chronic heart failure, anemia.
And is there a mechanism proposed for that link?
Yes. Particularly for cancer-related fatigue, the cytokine theory is prominent. Pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-1 beta and TNF-alpha, which are often elevated in cancer and its treatment, are thought to directly signal the brain in ways that produce profound fatigue, often worse in the morning.
Okay, inflammatory signals causing fatigue.
Which leads us to the really complex one, Myalgic Encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME/CFS.
Right. This one seems notoriously difficult to diagnose.
It is, partly because it's defined by disabling fatigue lasting at least 6 months, but also because it comes with a constellation of other nonspecific symptoms: muscle pain, cognitive issues, sleep problems that overlap heavily with things like fibromyalgia or depression.
So how is it diagnosed? The CDC criteria seem key here.
Absolutely crucial. The source emphasizes these. To meet the criteria for ME/CFS, the fatigue itself must be severe, persistent for over 6 months, and significantly impairing daily activities. But it also requires 3 core symptoms.
Okay.
1. The persistent fatigue itself. 2. Post-exertional malaise, or PEM. This is a hallmark. Yeah, it means symptoms get significantly worse after physical, mental, or emotional exertion, and this worsening can last for days or even weeks. It's a disproportionate payback for activity.
Okay. Disproportionate payback. Got it. And number 3.
Unrefreshing sleep. Waking up feeling just as tired or even more tired than when you went to bed.
So severe fatigue, post-exertional malaise, and unrefreshing sleep. Those 3 are essential.
Yes. Plus, you need at least one of 2 additional symptoms. Either significant cognitive impairment, like brain fog, trouble concentrating, or orthostatic intolerance. Symptoms worsen when standing up, like dizziness or lightheadedness.
That's quite specific, actually.
It is. It helps differentiate it, though the underlying cause, the etiology, is still debated and researched. The source mentions theories involving the HPA axis, genetics, maybe infectious triggers.
Let's touch on that HPA axis idea again. What's the theory there for ME/CFS?
The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is our central stress response system, controlling cortisol release. In ME/CFS, some evidence suggests there might be an overall hypoactivity, a sort of dampening of this axis.
So low cortisol.
Potentially, yes, or at least a blunted response. This disruption in the body's core stress and energy regulation system, possibly triggered initially by an infection or other stressor that maybe hyperactivated the immune system, could be a key mechanism linking physiological dysfunction to that profound, disabling fatigue. It's complex, still being studied.
Okay, wow. We've really covered a huge range here. From the nitty-gritty of growth plates
Yeah, the precise mechanics
to
there.
the molecular dance of RNKL and OPG in bone remodeling.
The failures of that maintenance cycle.
And finally ending up with the systemic, debilitating experience of chronic fatigue and ME/CFS.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How things that seem so different, a kid's bone shape, an older adult's fracture risk, someone's overwhelming exhaustion, can all be traced back to fundamental principles of biological systems trying, and sometimes failing, to maintain balance, to maintain homeostasis. The skeleton isn't just scaffolding, it's an active, metabolic, homeostatic organ.
That's a great way to put it. And before we wrap up, we always like to leave you, the listener, with something to think about, a final provocative thought.
Ah, yes.
The source material, Porth's, mentions the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, the USPSTF, and interestingly, they actually caution against routine screening for things like idiopathic scoliosis in asymptomatic teenagers, and even against universal screening for DDH in infants without risk factors.
Right, because the evidence for benefit wasn't strong enough to outweigh potential harms.
Exactly, which raises a really critical question for all of us, whether we're future clinicians or just informed individuals. How do we balance that drive for early detection, wanting to catch things early, with the very real possibility of causing harm? Unnecessary tests, anxiety, interventions like bracing for conditions that might have just resolved on their own.
It's a tough balance.
Yeah.
Especially when conditions exist on a spectrum, and many mild forms might have minimal long-term impact.
Definitely something to mull over as you integrate all this information about musculoskeletal health and disease.
Indeed. And thank you, as always, for sharing your source material with us for this deep dive.
Our pleasure. Until next time on The Deep Dive.